Wonderful. So as I mentioned, this is the second of our 4-part workshop series on hybrid engagement, specifically focused on hybrid meeting design. Just quickly to orient ourselves to Zoom, I'm going to highlight the chat for today. You all are muted and we ask that you remain muted for sound purposes today, but we really encourage you to engage with us in the chat. Here at MAPC, the community engagement team are active chat users and really encourage chat engagement. So please give us feedback, share your questions, react to what we're sharing. We really want to be in conversation with you today. I will also note that you can toggle your speaker view. If you'd like to see other folks in the Zoom room, you can switch to gallery, although the current view is set to speaker. And just briefly going over our agenda today, I'm going to share a few words about our hybrid initiative project as a whole, and then I will pass it to Amy Livingston, who is joining us from CDM Smith to talk about hybrid learnings that she's experienced in her work. And then we are going to go through a collaborative event design process, which we're all looking forward to. So just very briefly, I'd like to shout out our project partners, Leon Goodwin, Sarah McDonald, Amanda Smith, Michelle Tyler, and Ala Abusala, who are joining us today. Without them, this project would not be possible. They are key strategists and thought partners in developing hybrid engagement strategy across the region. So we're really happy to have them here and on this project. I'd also like to give a big shout out and thank you to Amy Livingston, who is the Infrastructure and Public Involvement Discipline Leader at CDM Smith and has kindly joined us today to share some of her wisdom and knowledge about hybrid engagement. We're really excited for you to hear from her today. And lastly, I'd like to shout out my community engagement team, the folks who are working tirelessly on this project day and night, have helped curate this workshop series that you are participating in today and are contributing to all of the resources that we are hoping to produce at the end of this project to really make sure that folks in the region and more broadly in the community engagement world have the tools they need to succeed in hybrid work. So a really big thank you to Emily, Carolina, Yolando, and Christian. Just a few group agreements for today. We encourage you to use I statements, especially when you're talking about your own experience or opinions in the chat. If you're someone who participates often and has a lot of questions, that's great, and we welcome that. We also encourage folks to take up space if that's not something that you normally do. We really do want to hear from all of you today, so really encourage your participation. We ask for use of accessible language. I know for me that often means making sure I'm spelling out all of my acronyms and saying them fully. And we also really encourage leaning into edges today. Hybrid engagement is an evolving process. There's constantly new information and data coming out about the best way to engage folks in a hybrid way, and we are still learning as well. So we're expecting a lack of closure from this space, and we're also listening for understanding rather than to set determined ideas. And lastly, active participation. I know I've mentioned the chat a few times. I'm going to keep doing it. We really love the chat and really encourage you using that today. So just a brief timeline. We started this project back in June. We were really hearing from our municipalities a need to develop hybrid engagement strategy and to have some tools on how to best work with people in a way that still allowed access to remote participation, but also factored in opportunities to engage and connect with one another in person when it was safe to do so. And so in the process of this, we developed this workshop series as a way to connect and hear from all of you and share some of our learnings. And at the end of this, we are hoping to have a toolkit of resources that we can share consistently and continue to contribute to as we learn more about the hybrid world we are emerging into. And today we are on our second of our 4 workshop series, as I mentioned. Very briefly, I would just like to touch upon what is a hybrid meeting. We know there are many definitions for hybrid engagement and for hybrid events. Today specifically, we are talking about an in-person event that includes a remote component and where you have participants joining either in person or remote as well, and have two ways of participating and are both receiving information and providing information, whether that's feedback, questions, participating in conversation. There are several other types of events that may be relevant to hybrid engagement, but we are specifically focusing on these types of events where we have folks joining from two places at once and participating either remotely or in person at the same time. And so some things we won't be focusing on is asynchronous communication. So for example, using hosting an in-person event and a remote event separately, multi-layered engagement or online only events, as well as events that are one-way communication. So events where there is no participation from the audience. Those are really important events to address, but for the purpose of focus and specificity, we will not be talking about them today. So with that, welcome. And I'm going to actually stop my screen share and pass it over to Amy to share about her work and some of the learnings that she and her team have had through their experience in hosting hybrid engagement over the course of the past year.
All right, thank you, Sasha. Can you see my screen clearly?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to check and make sure. Thank you all so much for allowing me to participate in this series. I was mentioning ahead of time, this series in and of itself is quite innovative and something that I haven't seen really put forth in this level of effort across the country. I'm Amy Livingston, as Sasha mentioned, and I work for a firm, CDM Smith, and I serve as the National Discipline Leader for Public and Stakeholder Engagement. So this type of thing that you're talking about today is really, this is my bread and butter and what I love to be involved in. I do have to note before I even get started, I've already taken a couple of notes of things that I would love to put into my next best practices, including that dance party. I think it's really awesome, a great way to make something a virtual world sometimes can feel very impersonal. So we're already starting off in a great note. So appreciate that. As background, someone mentioned also that perhaps maybe I might not be local, and that is true. I live in the Charleston, South Carolina area and work on projects throughout the country. A lot of different planning type projects and also some with the federal government as well. So today I'm just going to quickly talk about just some foundations of successful engagement. I feel very hard to talk about any of this stuff without just coming back to the basics, just for a quick touch point. And then also highlighting again some of those challenges and opportunities that hybrid engagements might bring, and then move into really what I would consider the meat of this presentation, which is those best practices and lessons learned for hybrid engagements. So just back at the beginning, we're probably all have similar principles of engagement. You as organizations probably hold some similar ones here, but I think it's important that as we're thinking forward to how do we effectively build hybrid engagement here, that we come back to some of these general principles that hold true whether you're in person, virtual, or hybrid. You know, are you being transparent? Do you provide that interaction like the chat room here? Is the information timely? Are you being inclusive? Is it accessible, like the language? So I will try very hard with the acronyms as well. That can be challenging for us. And to me, kind of most importantly, are you doing this in a thoughtful way? So moving into that, let's talk a little bit about those challenges and opportunities. And just as Sasha mentioned earlier, this is kind of what we're talking about as the center space where in-person and virtual engagement blend together. I think we're all very familiar with some of the the opportunities, those positive aspects of in-person meetings. We've probably got a lot of experience with those. And then now also with virtual over the last 2 years, we've learned a lot of those really great opportunities that we have there, but also some of the challenges. And what I want to just focus on just a little bit today is the fact that hybrid engagements give you the opportunity to bring together those positives or those opportunities that you have with in-person and virtual. We all know that this gives people multiple ways to participate. It makes it easier sometimes for people to access because they have opportunity. But I do think there are some challenges that still remain or could remain from virtual engagement whenever you are operating in a hybrid environment. And I just think it's good to take these in and put them in the back of your head so that when you're doing your planning, you're thinking about how have I addressed this particular challenge that I might have with my audience? And that's what I'm always putting in the back of my mind. So accessibility, you'll see, it's top of mind for me, and it probably had moved more so in the last year and a half, 2 years of virtual engagement. But this is one of those situations where, we had potential challenges with virtual, and they can remain with hybrid. And when I bring this up, I'm thinking about your ADA compliance, your limited English proficiency, just technical experience of the audience, internet access type of things. Some others of those challenges I think that we should just still keep in our minds as we're moving forward that can span both virtual and hybrid include those distractions. I mean, how many of you right now, please don't tell me, please don't raise your hand, are also reading emails or there's fire going off because all of a sudden something's happened. I mean, that happens to all of us. There's a screaming baby in the background, or you hop on and either you're hosting the meeting and the tool is unfamiliar for you because maybe you've used it a million times and the software company has made an upgrade, and now you hop on and all of a sudden it's different, right? None of us have ever had that happen in the last year and a half, right? And then I think facilitation. Facilitation can be really challenging in a virtual engagement because you don't get that audience feeling. You can't, for somebody like me, I love to feed off the energy of the audience, and that can be really challenging. Well, when you add hybrid, it's like, whoa, now you have two audiences that you've got to facilitate, and that can be pretty challenging as well. And managing conflicts, I don't know about you guys. My background actually before I worked in CDM Smith is I worked in local government. So municipal communications is really my background before coming to this. And I don't know if it's you or maybe it's just where I work, but there's often things that we have to talk about that people don't like. They're not in favor of every plan that comes up. And so building that trust and managing conflicts virtually can be another thing to think about. And then I think there are a couple of challenges that are quite unique in the hybrid engagement realm. First off, I think that, you always need an agenda, you always need a facilitation plan, and I can tell they have a really great one planned for this meeting, but it becomes particularly complex when handling a hybrid engagement facilitation plan because you're thinking about those multiple audiences. You're thinking about how you can pull them together. So that's something to really think about in your planning. How are you providing a consistent message to those people? And that's maybe a little bit more of a challenge when you're thinking about the other types of hybrid engagement is not happening simultaneously. But just some things to think about as we're moving forward. And this is where I promised Sasha I'd spend a little bit more time on real world, what we did. Again, I always have to come back to when you're planning something, first and foremost, thinking about what is the purpose of this engagement. And I know today we're thinking about two-way communications, right? And a situation where you need that, but that may not always be the case. And so I think it's important to think back of what you're trying to get out of this engagement. And that come back to that throughout your planning process. Always thinking about your audience, what type of engagement has worked in the past, any types of barriers this particular audience might have, because with the flexibility of hybrid engagement, perhaps there's an opportunity to overcome that challenge that you didn't have previously. So just something to think about. And I know you guys know about this, budgets and schedule, and those are always factors no matter what you do, who you work for, what you plan. So just, I know Sasha mentioned today we're going to live in this top box where we're talking about what we would consider synchronous, live, in-person, live, virtual. And synchronous, kind of a funky word, but really what we're talking about here are engagements that are live and they're happening at the same time. Some other options, she mentioned, or maybe they're happening at different times or multi-layered, but we're going to focus in this top box to begin with. So really, when we're thinking about this type of hybrid engagement, to me, it becomes even more of a balance, right? You've got this in-person audience and the venue that comes along with them and the staffing that comes along with them and potentially the travel that comes along with them for your staff or for the audience, right? And then you've got this other world over here that is virtual, right? You've got the platform, which is kind of like the venue online. You've also probably got staffing associated with this. And then you're also balancing how people are accessing it, how you're accessing it. Because if people can't access this meeting, whether in person or online, you don't have a meeting, right? So we developed a checklist for how to get started on hybrid engagements. I did mention on my cover slide that this is the next frontier, and I will often call hybrid engagements the wild, wild west. And I say that in an endearing way because there's so much room for creativity. There's so much room for innovation. How you think about these, you may have 20 more steps between these, but these are just your general, I need to get started, what do I even think about types of things. So the first thing I mentioned earlier, and I always start with this, is what is the goal of the engagement and what type of engagement are you really looking for? Is it two-way? Is it one-way? And then that can really help you understanding your audience, can help you determine the platform for the virtual component. Personally, by now, a lot of organizations have decided, hey, this is our virtual platform that we're using, and that's really great. You may have that, and so you already know the opportunities and limitations of that. But if your world is open, you might want to start thinking a little bit more about that goal and how you might be able to engage with this, because maybe a different platform is the right fit for this. Selecting a venue and is really what I think about next, because that platform and the venue do need to work together in certain ways. We'll talk about some lessons learned a little bit later related to your physical space and tying those pieces together. I used to laugh. I planned a lot of public meetings, and finding a venue was just something I never even thought about. It was really easy. And then over the last 2 years, the venues that I have used for large public meetings, they're no longer available, right? Because there are concerns of bringing people in person. We would often use schools, and schools are not allowing people to come in because of the concerns with that. So really thinking about your venue up front and what you need in a venue, what kind of technology capabilities you might have, the type of spacing you might need, how you might be able to set up some AV in that space. If you can, definitely go in and see the venue, take pictures, write it down. And then the next piece is really where I think the meat of this is, and that's creating the facilitation plan. I think I saw in the chat box someone asking a little bit about that, and I think we'll circle on a little bit later, but this is really, to me, the crux of it. It's, we used to have just a meeting plan, and now we have a full facilitation plan. And part of what you're doing there is thinking about, how can I serve both audiences? And how can I clearly identify the role of who is playing, who is assisting with the chat window here, right? Like I'm confident there are people on this team that are assigned to watch that chat box and make sure that we're taking notes. That was clearly defined in a plan, and that's going to be needed in a hybrid engagement as well. And then I would say, once you've for me, I like to have an understanding of how we're creating the meeting and what kind of interaction we're going to do and how we might help those worlds meld together. And then that's when I start creating materials. And one time a client said to me, she goes, well, does it really matter if we're in person or virtual for this? And I was like, yeah, it really matters. And when we're creating the materials, because think about if somebody is viewing this on their cell phone, how big is that screen? Right? I mean, I know there's some big cell phones right now, but they're not the same size as a monitor. And so the amount of text that I put on there might be different. So if I'm having an in-person meeting and I have a slide, I may need even fewer items on that for the people who might be watching it from their cell phone. And that's something we didn't have to think about before. It's just those little nuances there. I put in here polls. I think those are really great to encourage engagement across the worlds, as we'll call it. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So you've gone through all this planning, and I say ensure accessibility here. It's really should probably be shown as a line across the top. You really need to think about it every step of the way. But when you get to a certain point, you need to stop and say, okay, have I really looked at this? Have I done everything that I can do? Have I done a contrast checker to make sure people with maybe limited eye impairments don't have an issue versus any type of closed captioning, or what is really required for your situation, and what do you guys like to do as an organization as well, right? There's two different things. There's the required, and then there's what is your organization's culture towards this and the language. And then, you got to invite people or market it and get it out there. And you really have to practice. And then this is a little bit more about happening in that particular day. We normally practice that day as well. We'll set up again. We'll connect the virtual stuff, practice, and then move on to the audience. So I want to move into a little bit of the lessons learned, and you'll see that they sort of follow this plan or this guideline or step-by-step that we've had. So planning the plan is really important. I mentioned that earlier. I recently had the opportunity to interview public involvement specialists across the country who were doing some pretty innovative things. And one particular case study that came up was quite interesting in that they were facilitating an interagency working team. And the facilitators themselves and some of the members of the audience were virtual and everyone else was on site. And so that is even more challenging, right? To not have anybody who's running the meeting there in person. Would not recommend, but they made it work. And the way they made it work was really honing in on that plan, every ounce of it. Yeah, it was intense. And I am also glad that was not my meeting, but I learned a lot from them, and it had to do with their planning. They also felt for that particular type of working group or workshop, it helped have a pre-meeting with all of the key players to talk through where the priorities were and the potential conflicts, and really hash that out to they had minute by minute a plan there. And so that really spoke to me, as they said we couldn't do it if we had not planned so well, and we couldn't have done it if we hadn't talked with all of those key members across the different agencies. Something else I talked about is bridging that gap between the worlds, because now you have at least two audiences, right? You have one in person and one online, and you have to have, in my opinion, if you don't take anything else, is you have to have that person that sits between those worlds. In that example that I just gave, they said that was also crucial to their success. So they did identify someone that they knew who was part of this workshop, who could sit in person and who was able to be there. And their role was to make sure that, number one, we didn't lose the people online, right? Sometimes when you're having meetings, discussions can happen in person and you forget about those people online. And that's not good, right? Because they need to be equally part of this. But I have been calling this role the online liaison. I would say the minimum level is to have one person who who is in person, ideally, and they're there to speak up for those people. For instance, if you were having a meeting and we're using the chat like now, and I'm presenting, it would be helpful to have that person raise their hand or flag or really draw my attention to the fact that there's something that we need to be attentive to online. For instance, I just saw someone comment in that they love how I call it two worlds. And to me, sometimes it can feel a world apart. And so that's why I've been calling it that. But that person could let me know that Emily has a comment that she needs to make. And they're really there, in my opinion, to be the advocate of those online and to quality assurance of what's going on. Now, if you have additional staff, you might consider having someone who is also remote, who is online but not in person, but is part of your team, who has an alternate method of communicating with your team. Preferably that liaison is a really great way to do it, so that they get the full online experience and can step up and say, hey, liaison, we're missing this or something, because oftentimes your audience is going to step up. They're not, they may be shy and not letting you know that they're not getting everything that they need. Now, we know we sometimes have audiences that let us know too much, but it's just something to think about. Another lesson learned from some of these is, depending on your meeting type, you may want to have someone who is in person. They could be remote, but I think in person is perhaps best. That is taking notes as well. Maybe they're using a whiteboard and taking notes, and those notes are visible and they're shared on the screen in the room, but also online, and that can help a lot to bridge the gap, especially if there's any audio issues. If they're visually writing it down and taking some notes, that it can help people follow along and can help with those distractions that might be having. Yes. So I see someone pointed out that, yes, like sound quality, some people just leave the meeting, and that is exactly what you don't want to have happen, right? You've done all this work and all this planning, and you don't want to let somebody go. And I agree, captions are also a really great example. If you have the ability to do that, whether they're live or automated, that can help a lot as well. So another item, we're talking about technology here, and I think technology, man, you got to learn to love it. That's the truth of the matter. So this particular meeting that's on the screen was a public hearing that was being held, both live in person and online. And what you see on the screen is actually their Teams meeting, and the image on the right is a camera that they had in person facing the audience, and the image on the left is a camera that they had facing, unfortunately I couldn't find one where I could see both of them, but it's facing where somebody would walk up to the microphone to speak. So it was a really interesting idea on how to bring the people who are online to see what's going on. And as I mentioned, right, like it's really hard to get a feeling for the sense of the room when you're virtual, and this is one way to do that. So here, I think at a minimum, if you can, having one camera is great, but multiple cameras are even better. And these are set up in such a way that one camera is one user and the other camera is another user, and that's how they were able to set that up. And then the one camera that is facing the audience in the room, they just had it muted so there weren't sound issues back and forth. So just something to consider. And on the opposite spectrum, how do you bring the people who are online so you can see in person? And I don't know if you noticed this goofy little person right here. That's me. As Sasha mentioned, there's gallery modes now in a lot of these platforms. So one idea that we've seen is pulling a screen into the room to share that particular gallery so the people in the room can see the folks online. And that's the other side that we often forget about. Is I think early on we did a really great job of showing what was happening in person to the people online, but I think we're moving is showing those people online to the people in person. That's another dynamic. So this next lesson learned does not fit every particular situation. Like for instance, I think we're having some really great engagement. This is more of a webinar. We've got some really great engagement with the chat box. The key here is that you want people participating, if they're online or in person, to have the same opportunities and the same access, whether that's making comments or asking questions or feeling engaged or building trust with those audiences. You really have to think about, if I'm giving this opportunity in person, how can I do that online? A lot of times I say asking questions in that direction because so many of us are wired to think about what happens in person. And so the online is often forgotten about, or maybe it's, the last thought that they had. But it's really important because you don't want those people to feel like they're not getting the same access. Or that it's not valuable for them to participate online. There's so many reasons why they may want to participate online past this current pandemic. So, one opportunity is using that liaison, right, that we talked about earlier, that if there are questions in the chat box to be able to read those out. If you're not set up for people to come off their microphone, let that person be their voice. I've seen it done both ways, where you handle all the stuff in person and then you handle all the stuff online. And I think that can be easier, a lower risk situation, but it also becomes higher risk to make the people who are online feel like they're second class citizens. And so the example that I showed you earlier, where they were in the auditorium, they actually mixed it back and forth between commenters who were online and in person, and it provided a little bit more variety. It was more challenging from a technology standpoint. So I think those are kind of on a continuum opposite ends of the spectrum. And so I've just put a couple of other ideas. If you're doing flip charts in person, think about how you're using the whiteboard online, or a Word document, or a shared Google Doc, or some other type of interesting tool that's online. I mentioned polls earlier. Something that we had been trying to work through recently and have finally settled on for a particular meeting is using a phone-based poll for this particular audience. It makes a lot of sense. We know that most people who are going to be in this particular room do have a phone. And so they'll be able to access the poll. So all of the poll results come into the same place. So that's something. I see in the chat box here that Jamboard is something that's used a lot for collaboration. Feel free, guys, if you have great tools, please put them in the chat box so everybody can see them. I think this is a great opportunity for us to learn from one another. And, one biggest pet peeve, I mentioned it earlier, is a lot of times when you have in-person meetings, there can all of a sudden be these discussions. There can be these discussions that are happening and all of a sudden kind of take over. And then next thing you know, the people online can't hear. That's why it's so important that that facilitator in person really controls the audience so that multiple people aren't talking at the same time, because that can get really challenging and very frustrating. Again, so I think the next and last kind of lesson learned, because I think I'm out of time, is something that I hear from people and my colleagues at the Army Corps, Herb, is I do Zoom meetings, I do team meetings. I don't need to practice. I've got this. I'm good. I do this all the time. I talk to my colleagues. It is different when you have a public meeting or you're engaging with an audience that isn't your close team. You probably need to practice that. And something that I also have heard for people is, yeah, well, we practiced, the online part, or we practiced this part, but they didn't practice it on the same computer. They didn't practice it on location. They didn't practice putting it all together. And that's where it's complicated with hybrid meetings, right? And so make sure that you're using those as best you can, replicating those situations. I know it's not always possible. And just another little quick note is, if you're practicing some of these things, make sure you have somebody practicing as the audience, and make sure maybe they're on a personal computer, if that's appropriate. Just, you don't want them to be signed into anything that you have, because you need to understand the audience's experience, and maybe they practice offsite or in another room, or on a different internet connection, because sometimes there can be some weird nuances when you're on your own system versus you're somewhere else. So those are just some weird tech things that we've seen happen, and people just don't think about the fact that, yes, you're really preparing 2 meetings when you're doing hybrid, but you're preparing them as 1 meeting. So it's important to practice in that way. So that's all I have for today, Sasha. I mean, I am looking forward to learning from you all as well. As I mentioned, it feels like a realm where endless ideas are possible right now. And if you're a person who loves to solve problems and figure out workarounds, just like I do, this is your world now. You're very excited. And we think that after the pandemic, if it ever subsides, that people have this expectation. So it's awesome that you guys are really preparing yourself for this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing this information and some of your learnings. We really appreciate it, and I know we're very excited to hear about it. I know I learned from this presentation, and I'm excited to implement some of my learnings into my own work at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. So we're going to take a few minutes for questions before we transition into the next portion of today's event. So if folks have any questions for Amy, please feel free to share them in the chat. I'm going to start, Amy, with one question that came through the chat while you were presenting around engaging both groups of participants. I know you referenced really making sure that participation is equal and across the board, and that there is a way to make sure that participants who are joining remotely especially feel included and as valued as in-person participants. Could you speak to any additional ideas or tips that you have for engaging both groups fully throughout an event?
Sure. So it's kind of wide open, because I know you guys do a lot of different types of meetings. And one thing that when I talk to our team, because we advise a lot of project managers all over, and I talk to them and I say, well, what would you have done if we were doing this all in person? And they say, well, I would have done this and this and this. And I said, there's an online solution to this. Whatever it is that you would have done in person, there is a tool or a solution for that. And so I think while that's not a specific example, I think that that is the frame of mind that I like to take things in. So, I mean, I also think when you have the right situation, having speakers in the room so that people can chime in verbally. If people in person are able to go and talk from the microphone, sometimes, especially if they're commenting on something and you've got something that's heated, like some type of plan, and people want to feel heard by their peers, sometimes that's more important than actually there being a change. I think that if you can offer them even that basic opportunity, it could help them feel expressed and heard.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for that framing. I think that's really helpful, especially given that there are so many different kinds of meetings and purposes of engagement that folks may be focused on. Another question that just came through the chat is whether you have any recommendations on types of meetings that may be best suited for hybrid, whether that's specific clients that you've worked with who particularly enjoyed hybrid engagement, or specific types of events like public hearings.
Sure. So at first one might think, gosh, a public hearing is so formal. Is that well suited? How can we do this? That actually has been, in my opinion, one of the easiest things to move to a hybrid situation, because the types of hearings that I work on, there is maybe there's a presentation portion or an online type of, I know we're talking about meetings happening synchronously today, but with a lot of the public hearings that we've done a short presentation, but provided an open house in person and an open house online, meaning like a website that people could move around so they didn't have to do it in that moment. But then moving into just the presentation, and then since it's really not as much of a dialogue back and forth, that's why I say to me that's one of the easiest ones, because typically our public hearings, you have 2 to 3 minutes that you can state your name and address and your comment for the record. So that's easy, right? Because while you have two-way dialogue, it's not a full discussion. And so as you move into the more engaging items, it can become more challenging. Like for instance, that one I mentioned early on that someone said, I'm glad that wasn't my meeting, it was intense. That was actually what they call a project delivery team meeting. So it was different people across different agencies, and it was a contentious project, and they needed to get to some consensus at the end of that. And so that meeting, I would typically say, is very hard to do in a hybrid manner, because that conflict and that trust is so much easier in person. But sometimes we can't, it doesn't matter what it's better as. You have to work and figure out the solution to it. So I think that items, the more risky the project or the more contentious, the harder it can be to create two-way communication. It doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means you have to be more creative.
Thank you. And one last question I'd like to ask, and I noticed we have some technical questions in the chat, and I'm hoping to answer that in this next portion or when we have our second Q&A time. But one question that we've gotten a lot over the course of this project is around capacity. We've received a lot of concern of folks feeling that they may not have the staffing capacity or technical capacity to the degree that they would like in order to successfully host a hybrid event. Do you have any recommendations for when capacity is a big challenge for somebody who is hosting an event?
So like a resourcing challenge.
Or
I think
staffing?
it's probably a similar type thing, right? When you have a little more straightforward meeting, then you can get away with less capacity, less items. I mean, can you host these things without multiple cameras and multiple people doing? Absolutely. Kind of the point of telling you all that is to think bigger, is to think creatively. I know in my office, just here, I have monitors laying around and old stuff. How could we reuse some of those items? I think that getting yourself, if you have regular meetings, creating templates of how you do this stuff can help you a lot, because to me, a lot of the capacity is really on the front end, is on the planning side of things. That is where we spend most of our time. We spend so much more time planning virtual meetings than we did in person. And then when you move to hybrid meetings, it's even more, because you're trying to figure out how to blend those two things together. I do think over time, as we get better at it, as we learn preferences, as everyone gets used to that, that will go down. But right now, that it takes a whole lot. I mean, obviously there are firms like us that can help you with your capacity, but I would think about what your basics are. To me, the main thing that you really need is that liaison. That's the number one thing. If you can't have a camera in the room or somebody to do that, you're going to be okay. Just make sure that you're verbally expressing that and taking the time to think, okay, I can't do this, but how could I bring somebody in if I were sitting in this black box somewhere and didn't know what was going on? You can do all that. It just takes more creativity.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you for your presentation. We are going to move into the next portion of today's session, but before we do, I'm going to invite us all to just take a moment, close our eyes, and just take one deep breath. Absorb all the information, all the good learnings that we got from Amy. I will note that this is a very content-heavy session. We heard from many folks that you wanted content, which we are bringing today, but it is a lot to absorb. And so just taking a minute to process that information, I know is helpful for me. I'm going to share my screen again and bring us to the next portion of today's conversation. So now that we've heard from Amy, And we've heard about her checklist that she uses and some best practices that she's identified in her work. I'm going to expand upon that a little bit and share about the process that we have here at the community engagement team at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, how we go about making these decisions, with the hopes that this gives you frameworks and questions that you can ask yourself as you plan your next hybrid event. And I would like to start by echoing what Amy has said and reiterating that hybrid is a choice. It is not a default. And it is really a choice that is important to make when that is the most effective way to engage the population you are trying to connect with. We have many different tools at our disposal. Again, asynchronous or having separate events or separate engagement opportunities may be the better strategy given what you're trying to do. Hybrid is one wonderful, but not a default strategy. And we really want to emphasize this as a conscious choice that we make when we're designing an event. When we think about event design, we think about these 5 buckets. What is our purpose? Who are our stakeholders? What are the resources that we need or have? And from that, what are the communications that we'll need to develop and what is our approach? And the decision to do a hybrid event really lies within the communications and the approach buckets, but is determined by the purpose, stakeholders, and resources. When I think about purpose, we think about what does success look like for this event? And what are we trying to do? Are we informing? Are we collecting information? Are we decision making? Amy referenced the challenge that can come from decision making in various settings. This is really important to consider in terms of our purpose and how that relates to a successful event. And within that, Amy mentioned stakeholders and thinking about who they are and what their context may be, really considering how folks might be impacted by the event or the decisions that are being made in this event, and their level of influence on the conversation happening at the event is going to help determine what type of event and what approach within that event you may want to have. We also really encourage thinking about the needs that people have. And Amy mentioned a really helpful tip of referencing previous successful engagement with specific populations. That can be really helpful data to inform how you design your event. One example that I often reference with hybrid are folks who may have more tech needs. They may need more support and guidance in their technical experience. That may determine a lot of your communication and your approach if you do decide to host a hybrid meeting, so that folks can best engage with the material you're sharing. And with that, we talked about capacity earlier. Thinking about your resources and what you already have access to, what you can already leverage for your event is really helpful to also determine what you might need. Do you need to ask for additional staff? Do you need to ask for an additional computer for the day of? Do you need extra funding to host a hybrid event? These are all important questions to ask yourself depending on the needs and the parameters of the event that you decide to host. Once you've determined the answers to these questions, we move into the communications and the approach decision-making process. In thinking about communications, we're really zeroing in on what the key information is that we are trying to get across or that we are trying to receive from our participants. And also thinking about the participant self-interest and how they'll best engage with the information. For example, Amy mentioned keeping communications consistent. We also, in thinking about communications, are considering not just telling people, the place and the time and the main content, but also best ways to access the information that they need. For example, if we go back to the folks who may need more technical assistance, and if they are joining for a remote experience, we may include in our communications tips on how to access the remote meetings, or perhaps even a training before the event in order for them to feel like they can most effectively engage with the hybrid experience if they are choosing to participate remotely and require some assistance in being able to participate in that way. Communications really feed into the approach, which brings us back to the questions of our purpose. How are we informing? How are we informing, collecting information, or decision making? And this is really where the agenda, the action plan that Amy referenced comes into play, because that will really determine the process of the event and the process of achieving this purpose. Within this approach, we consider 4 big buckets: in-person setup, your virtual setup, your staffing, and your participants. And you'll notice that this really echoes Amy's checklist as well. And across that, we're thinking about our agenda or structure, which will probably determine a lot of the setup that we do and also the staffing that we allocate to an event. We're also considering the pre-work, in-event work, and post-work that we're doing, because there is work to do at each stage of your event. So we're going to try and apply some of these learnings together by collectively designing a town budget Q&A session. And some context to this session: you have about 50 participants. Some will be remote and some will be joining in person. All of the presenters and moderators for this session will be joining in person. And the in-person venue that you have access to for this event is a large conference room that has 1 webcam and a built-in sound system. So to start, please share in the chat, what else would you bring to your in-person setup for this event? What are some things that you would consider? Seeing another camera if possible, a Bluetooth connected microphone. Great suggestions. What else would you consider? What are other items? A way for the in-person people to see online participants. Interpreters. Interpreters are a very important staff to consider for accessibility. Additional microphones, an agenda, TV monitors. Great. We are all on the same page. Keep your suggestions coming. I'm going to name a few of the things that we bring to our in-person setup, starting with the computer. Amy mentioned the Zoom Liaison, which is a term we actually adopted after learning from Amy ourselves. And the computer is a key tool for that Zoom Liaison and for the in-person event staff to be able to access the remote event. Some folks mentioned additional screens, TV screens, or a projector and a projection screen are really helpful for 2 reasons. One, if you're doing a presentation for the event, it's really helpful to show the material to in-person participants on a larger screen, and you can project a PowerPoint presentation or a video to the in-person participants and mirror that projection on your remote participation screen. But you can also, when you're not projecting a presentation or a video, share the remote screen to the in-person participants. This gives them an opportunity to see the remote participants in a more accessible way. I will note we've heard from some remote participants that they don't like if they are speaking for their head to be the only thing on the projected screen or on the TV screen. So thinking about things like sizing, perhaps keeping it on a grid view is helpful to consider for people's comfort. Some folks mentioned extra webcams. Amy in her presentation mentioned extra microphones that can feed into a central sound system, all really important and helpful. We often hear from folks, I speak loud enough, I don't need a microphone. We heavily encourage using a microphone for a meeting. You never know when folks may need some hearing assistance and may benefit from having a microphone. Microphones make the audio clearer, and it helps both the in-person participants and remote participants hear one another in the most effective way possible. I'm seeing here Wi-Fi support and backup recording devices are also really helpful tools to bring with you. And thinking about any extras like batteries, backup computers are really great as well. I'm also just going to give a quick nod to your physical setup in terms of seating and tables or podiums that you might have for speakers. With that, something to consider is how you might identify in-person speakers or participants. This is especially important for remote participants who may not be able to see everything that's going on and fully see who's in the room. Having methods to identify folks, whether that's a plaque that they have in front of them or they're asking them to verbally identify themselves, are really important in considering your in-person setup. I'm also noting this because we are still in a pandemic and safety and health are primary concerns for any in-person event. So really considering the well-being of your participants who are joining in person, maybe having extra masks in case folks forget them, and reminding people to bring their mask, to bring sanitizer, and to socially distance as possible is really important for your in-person setup. Moving into your virtual setup. What are some setups that you have used in your virtual meetings or in your hybrid meetings that you have found useful for engaging participants? What are some tools or tricks that you've used? Put it in the chat. I'll give an example. Today, we're heavily relying on the chat as a form of engagement. Yep, setting expectations for virtual folks, instructions on how to engage. Any other virtual settings that you think about? Breakout rooms and post-it notes. Great. Yeah, so again, when we think about virtual setup, it all starts with the computer because this is your central space for your remote meeting. I will reference Zoom in the course of this meeting, mostly because MAPC primarily uses Zoom as its remote meeting platform. Most of these tools do translate to other meeting platforms like WebEx or Teams, although they may have slightly different names. It is still relevant to those platforms as well, if that is a platform that you use other than Zoom. So some things that we think about in the remote settings are the chat feature and spotlighting videos. The chat is really important to consider in a hybrid session because the chat may not be something that in-person participants can access. So set guidelines for how the chat will be used throughout the event is really helpful for both the in-person participants and the remote participants. For example, you may decide that the chat can only be used for technical questions. And if remote participants are going to have any content related participation, that they will need to unmute and participate verbally the same way that in-person participants are joining in the room. Or as an alternative, you may choose to rely on the chat as a way for folks to provide feedback and find another way to share what is happening in the chat to the in-person participants. So that decision is really helpful to make ahead of time in terms of your use of the chat. You can also turn off the chat if you feel that it is distracting for your meeting. That is something that folks have chosen to do as well. And then spotlighting your video. You'll notice when Amy and I were speaking without the screen share, our videos were spotlighted so that you could focus on our conversation. This is also helpful for when you're having one speaker. Again, I will note some folks don't love being spotlighted, so it is dependent on people's comfort, but it is something to consider as a tool at your disposal. Muting is probably one of the biggest things we talk about with remote meetings and also with hybrid participation. Deciding whether or not folks can unmute or mute themselves or whether you'll need to do that manually is really important to consider for the flow of your event and for audio and echo sounds throughout the event. And I'm just going to point out here some of your settings that are at the bottom of your screen if you're hosting a Zoom event. One thing I'll note is the record button and the closed captions, both of which you can enable throughout your event as other forms of access for folks, whether they can't make the event and will join later, or they could use closed captioning to better participate. I'm seeing here also some ability to display engineering or drawings, Having the share screen function is really important, and you can project the same content that you're projecting on the large screen in the physical space onto your Zoom or remote space as well. So really thinking about those two screens is helpful. So in thinking about setup, pre-event work is really where setup lives. Setting up early, and Amy mentioned this, testing things out, and thinking about the agenda and how that's going to drive the setup of your activities is really helpful before the event happens. You'll also want to consider how you're setting up for pivoting during the event. For example, in the Q&A session, let's anticipate that we would have a presentation to start and then questions and answers in the second half of the presentation. You may want to start with a setup that includes the presentation projected onto the big screen, and then transition the setup so that participants can see one another via the large projection screen. If it's a smaller group in person, you may want to consider how you set up your chairs. Perhaps people are sitting in a semicircle instead of sitting in rows, because that creates a more intimate space, a more connective space. These are all decisions that you can make based on what you are planning to do for your event, which again ties back to the purpose and to your stakeholders. And post-event, always helpful to factor some time for breaking down, especially for your in-person setup. So thinking about the staffing, Amy mentioned the Zoom liaison, which is also our key human when we think about a hybrid meeting. What are some other staffing roles that you think about when you are thinking about your hybrid events? Share it in the chat. Who are some other staff that you would include in an event? I'm seeing a recorder. Yep, a note taker. Definitely helpful. Any other staff that you would consider? Yep, so I'm seeing a breakdown of person to run the meeting, person to take notes, person to run the tech, having a facilitator, perhaps having a tech troubleshooter. Great, we are on the same wavelength here. If we were designing a hybrid event, I think we'd be doing great. So as Amy mentioned, we start with our Zoom liaison, and speaking to the capacity question that I asked earlier, if you are thinking about capacity, this is one role that is crucial to the success of a hybrid event that we have found at MEPC. Having one person who is just thinking about both the remote and the in-person experience is really fundamental to the success of the event. And I can point out some areas where the Zoom liaison can take on other roles if you do not have enough staff. Some folks mentioned tech setup, thinking about folks that you can assign to be in-person setup support, and those can be people who are also facilitators later on, but having enough hands to help you with the physical setup is always helpful. And also, if you do have capacity, having a remote staff person who can set up the virtual meeting is also very helpful, so that their focus primarily is on the remote participants. You'll also most likely have in-person facilitators for your event. In this particular event example, all of our facilitators are in person, and they are also speaking or potentially presenting during the event. So thinking about how those facilitators are interacting with the liaison is really important. Amy gave the example of the liaison speaking up if facilitators are not speaking loud enough, or if remote participants are having trouble accessing their information. That's one example. You may, for some events, consider also having a virtual facilitator. There was a question earlier about how to best engage both groups. Sometimes we found if you're breaking out folks into smaller discussions, it may logistically be easier to have in-person participants gather in small groups and then have your remote participants gather in small breakout rooms, and have designated remote facilitators who are facilitating on the same content, who have similar content knowledge, but are able to really give their entire attention to the remote group, and then bring everybody back into a hybrid space for a centralized conversation. So this does separate out the participants, but it gives them an opportunity to come together. And something to consider is that you will need additional staffing if you choose to have virtual facilitators. And I'll just note that all of these people are coming into communication with one another, or hopefully will be doing that throughout the event. So identifying ways that folks are communicating with one another, whether that's via a text thread or via a chat, is really helpful so that people can adjust as needed. I will say for myself, I don't think I posted a single event that has operated 100% as planned. Being able to pivot is really key, and making sure that your team is in communication with one another is really helpful for that process. So we use the rule of thumb that it's always best to have more staff than less, and you can always send some staff home or dismiss them if you realize that you have more staff than necessary for an event. However, due to capacity, we recognize that that may not always be possible. So some areas that your liaison can really step in is in the virtual setup support, as well as virtual facilitation. So if you do wind up in a situation where you really only have capacity for in-person staff and for one or two liaisons, having those liaisons pivot to the virtual experience when needed can be a good way to address this issue. It just means that rather than joining remotely, they would be in the physical room and maybe step out when they're participating live in terms of their remote facilitation. So those are some ways that the liaison can really take on or absorb other roles if capacity is a concern. So I mentioned during the event, having ongoing communication is really important. And pre-event, what we're really thinking about is making sure that staff are prepared and have the information they need for success. So is that an agenda that we have designed and written up that people can read and reference for their roles? It might be sending an email to folks to clarify what it is that we are asking them to do during an event. Amy mentioned running through and practicing. We also heavily encourage doing this. This is one key thing that we do for every event. We did it for this event. Running through every portion of your meeting is really helpful. And then again, deciding on your mode of communication and making sure that folks have access, as Amy also mentioned. And then post-event, we really love doing debriefs with our team, making sure that we understand what went well, what could have gone better, what we might need to adjust. As we mentioned at the beginning, and as Amy has mentioned, this is an emerging space, and there are many ways to do things. We are all learning, and every event is a learning opportunity and a growth opportunity. So taking a moment of reflection and identifying ways to be stronger as a team moving forward is really helpful for long-term success and more meaningful engagement. I just want to reiterate what Amy said about participants and making sure that they are having an equal experience across the board. All of these design questions really reference the participant experience. How are we making sure that participants can see and hear each other? Like I mentioned, we have that Zoom screen, the TV screen or projector. We might have extra microphones. Those are all rooted in this question of making sure participants can connect with one another. How are participants identified? Making a clear process for that identification and making sure that people feel comfortable and understand who is in each respective world is really helpful for creating a more connective event. Amy mentioned accessing the materials and adjusting those materials for various modes of access is very important, and also orienting people to this space. So we really encourage at the beginning of a session, especially a hybrid session, developing 5 to 10 minutes to walk both the hybrid and the in-person participants through the event, orienting the in-person participants to what remote folks are experiencing, and orienting remote participants to what the in-person participants are experiencing is really helpful for developing mutual understanding. One strategy that we used when people were onboarding to remote meetings was actually doing trainings. so that by the time that people got to the event itself, they understood what the process was, how people were going to be called on, how people could participate, that those guidelines were set and those practices were set ahead of time, and they were practiced with the participants themselves and then enacted in the event. You can do the same for a hybrid event, really setting the stage for people ahead of time and remaining consistent in that messaging is helpful so that people can understand how they can connect and what is expected of them, whether they're joining in person or joining remotely. And then making sure that you're including all sets of participants, again, thinking about equity and making sure that remote participants feel as involved as in-person participants, perhaps considering flipping the order in which you ask people questions, encouraging the remote participants to share their questions first, and then turning to the in-person participants could be a way to do this. And then, like I mentioned earlier, how are you best preparing your staff to engage so that they can best support participant experience? One layer that I'd like to point out here is that for remote participants, you may have a whole other layer of people joining by phone, which means that they don't even have a screen that they're looking at. They don't even have a visual to reference. So again, really encouraging that walking through and context setting, I think, is key to making sure that everyone is on the same page. And it also humanizes all of us. It recognizes that we are all in different places. We have different capacity. Nothing is going to be perfect, and that's okay. It sets the context that we're all working together and working with one another, as opposed to having a perfect unspoken event with an unspoken way of doing things. So it really brings everybody into the process the more you orient people to the space. Equity and power dynamics are really important considerations to have in designing your hybrid meeting and in considering your participants. We are not heavily going to get into those questions today because that really warrants an entire session of its own. But we did want to note that it is important when you're thinking about participants and their needs and their context, thinking about those power dynamics and how to alleviate them and make sure that people feel most comfortable is really crucial to having a successful and meaningful event. So I just want to wrap up by putting these learnings and these approaches within the context of an agenda. So let's say that our event starts at 6 p.m. If our event starts at 6 p.m., we would probably start setting up around 4:30, 5 for the event to happen. By starting at 4:30 or 5, that gives you 30 minutes to an hour to set up the physical space in person, to set up the remote space, and to test out any technical issues that you may have. So again, opening that Zoom line at the same time as you're setting up in person is really helpful so that you can make sure that the two ways of communication are operating successfully. I'll note something I forgot about in-person events while doing remote events for so long was that people sometimes show up early and want to network with one another and want to connect, which is wonderful, and we want to make space for that. For the sanity of event staff, it's helpful to be prepared and done with setup by the time early participants are arriving. So we generally buffer 30 minutes for that. So our setup would be done by 5:30, giving us 30 minutes to welcome people as they join. Something to consider here is the remote participant experience. If you're having people network in person, is there a way that you can create a networking opportunity remotely? Perhaps that is by having folks join early and go into a breakout room to connect with each other. Perhaps it's by setting up computer stations so that in-person participants can connect directly with remote participants and have a conversation. Those are just some things that you can consider as you think about how you would like to use that time. And then moving into the event, setting aside those 10 minutes to really orient people to the space, and then moving into the presentation and the Q&A, thinking about your setup and your process in terms of who is raising their hand when, who is being called upon when, how people are asking their questions, whether they're using the chat or unmuting themselves or waiting to be called upon, are all really helpful decisions to make as you're thinking through your agenda. I know that this is a lot of information, and I'm personally someone who learns by doing, but what we're hoping here in hearing from Amy and in walking through this event together is that there are some key questions and decisions that you can use as a framework for the events that you design, noting that every event is a little bit different and may require some adjustment. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just do a quick temperature check. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being I don't know anything about hybrid engagement and feel very fuzzy, to 5 being I am ready to go and host my next hybrid meeting. Where are you at right now? Any answer is okay. Oh, I'm seeing a lot of 5s. Great. Some 4s, some 3s. Great. 3.5 in the middle. Wonderful. 3s. Great. Okay. So we have just a few minutes left. I do want to make some time for questions. So if you do still have any questions, can you share them in the chat? And I'm also going to look to my community engagement team to see if there are any questions that I missed in the chat earlier. So we did receive a question around facilitating a meeting with more than one language. This is really important to consider, especially when you're thinking about your stakeholders and their needs. If you have folks joining who have a language other than English, having opportunities to facilitate in multiple languages is very important. And of course, having the layer of hybrid complicates things. We will say on Zoom, there is an interpretation function. So it is an effective way to make sure that participants who are joining remotely can hear what is happening and engage with the interpreter. If you're thinking about facilitation, you may consider having a small group that is entirely facilitated in the language that you are accommodating for. And then if you're considering a remote interpreter, you may also want to consider an in-person interpreter. So that way, both remote participants and in-person participants are experiencing interpretation in the way that is most easily accessible for them. If you do decide to go with just one interpreter, for example, having that interpreter only in person, making sure that the remote participants can hear that interpreter well will really be crucial. You could also consider having your interpreter join remotely and have them projected onto the screen for the in-person participants and connect them to that audio through a separate microphone. So those are some tips. If folks have other tips in the chat, please share. But those are some ways that we've thought about hosting folks who may have different language needs. I'm seeing a question about timing, and what I will say is that there is, quite a range of timing that works for people depending on their needs and their work lives. That's one of the reasons remote has been such a successful way to engage people, folks who are, have childcare needs or are cooking dinner for their family or who have longer work hours, who may not be able to get to an in-person meeting, can sign on via Zoom or via a remote platform and still be able to participate. So having the hybrid engagement can really allow for that. I would also say this is a moment where asynchronous engagement really comes into play. What are opportunities that you can take in whatever engagement you're trying to do that allow people who couldn't make the meeting per se or the event per se engage at another time? Do you have information on a website? Do you have recordings available? Do you have another way that people can provide feedback? That can be a good workaround for time constraints, which unfortunately are a big blocker for many events. I'm just going to scroll through here and look for some more questions. I'm seeing one about disruptive participants. It's an excellent question. In some ways, remote participation has made this easier, right? You can't, I was in a meeting the other day and somebody said you can't mute people in real life or in person, even though sometimes we may want to mute somebody in person. And that is true. Remotely, it's a little bit easier to politely interrupt people by muting them and by setting that precedent, by keeping people muted, starting a meeting with folks muted, and directing people to specific channels. In person, it's a little bit harder to do that because in some ways folks have more agency in that regard. And I think this is really where norm setting comes into play, and also setting expectations in advance. So, you know, at the beginning, when we were transitioning into the remote world, we were experiencing some Zoom bombings that had happened and some disruptions. The way we adapted to this is we acknowledged that this is possible at the beginning of a meeting and shared with participants what our plan was to address such a disruption. I think similarly with a hybrid event, you can anticipate some of those disruptions and set up processes in advance to address them. And if something unexpected comes up, it's okay to take a pause and say, we're going to pause right now to address this specific issue or challenge that has come up, and then navigate back to the planned agenda. So those are some tools that we've used. Also checking in with that participant who has been disruptive afterwards can be helpful if that is somebody who is an active community member. If it is a random stranger, perhaps you may not have access to that person after, and then it's more a question of removing them from the event or asking them to leave if they are participating in person. So we are at the last 5 minutes of our session, and I see that there are many questions here in the chat. We will take them and hopefully try to address them either via our website and resources or reaching back out to you. So please keep an eye out for that. This was recorded and we will be sharing both the slides and the recording with you via email as well as on our website, which I believe folks have shared in the chat. Thank you very much. We do have a survey for you, so please take it if you can. It is really helpful for us to receive feedback. I mentioned debriefing. We will be debriefing this session, so understanding your experience is really helpful for us. And then I just want to make a quick plug for the 3rd session of this series. It will be happening on October 20th, which is a Wednesday, from 1 to 2:30 p.m. We have heard a lot of questions about technology. I know that's a big concern, especially in thinking about hybrid engagement. And we're hoping to answer some of them in this session and hear more from experts. So please join us for that. And we'll be wrapping up the series with a conversation on policy, which has been the other access point that we've really been thinking about in determining hybrid engagement strategy across the region. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your participation. We really appreciate having you all here. Amy, thank you so much for your presentation and for sharing your knowledge with us. And we look forward to being in contact with all of you soon. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you all.